So good afternoon, everyone, or good evening, or good morning, depending on where you are listening to today's webinar. It's my pleasure to welcome you to CyberGRX's webinar, The 4 Pillars of a Scalable Third-Party Cyber Risk Management Program. We shorten that to an acronym for very obvious reasons. My name is Peter Finter. I'm the Chief Marketing Officer of CyberGRX, and I'm delighted to be hosting this afternoon's webinar with 3 experts in the space of third-party cyber risk management. And I'm going to give you a quick introduction to them, and we'll say hello as we go along here. Firstly, I want to start by welcoming Gideon. Gideon Rasmussen is a cybersecurity management consultant. He's got over 20 years of experience in corporate and military organizations. He's designed and led programs, including information security as a CISO, PCI for payment card security, third-party risk management, application security, and information risk management. He's got diverse industry experience as well. He's a man of many talents across banking, insurance, pharmaceuticals, the Department of Defense, US Air Force, state government, advertising, and talent management. I challenge you to find a field in which he has not worked. He has authored over 30 information security articles. He's a veteran of the United States Air Force, a graduate of the FBI Citizens Academy, and a recipient of the Microsoft Most Valuable Professional Award. He's also completed the Bataan Memorial Death March on 4 separate occasions. That sounds like a topic we definitely need to be including in third-party cyber risk management. Gideon, welcome, and thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Peter.
Our second guest is Shay Colson, and Shay Colson is a principal at Coastal Cyber Risk Advisors, where he focuses on helping private equity and venture investors manage portfolio cyber risk, including third-party and concentration risks. Previously, he worked with Fortune 50 clients to build and operate third-party cyber risk management programs, and he was the product lead for the development of a third-party risk SaaS platform. He is based in the Pacific Northwest. We are delighted, Shay, that you could join us today. Thank you so much for doing so.
Yeah, thanks, Peter. Glad to be here.
And finally, last but no means least, Gary Phipps. It seems that the 2-decade number is the one that joins us all together here, with more than 2 decades of experience providing program design support to sales initiatives, including risk management, regulatory compliance, and internal control enforcement for clients in various industries, including but not limited to, as said the legal advisor, finance, government, defense, healthcare, and higher education. Prior to joining CyberGRX, Gary ran solutions engineering for several software firms in the enterprise software space. Additionally, during his tenure as a risk professional, Gary acted as an advisor to many Fortune 50 financial institutions, as well as the Department of Defense, including the Joint Staff, on how to efficiently comply with regulatory statutes. Gary, welcome, and thank you for joining us today.
Thanks for having me, Peter.
So we have this esteemed group of people assembled together, and we have in mind one person, and that is you, our listener. The time that you're taking today, we want to be the most valuable time that you're spending in your day today. And we want to help you think through how third-party cyber risk can be managed more effectively with better outcomes in the future as a result of the work that you are now doing. And we are recognizing that everyone comes into this from different levels of maturity, different levels of experience. We hope there is going to be something in this for everyone, whether you're just starting out thinking about what you need to be doing, or whether you have a mature program and are looking to take it to the next level. What's really interesting is this data point, at least interesting to me, despite the fact that we're seeing more attention, more focus, more applications, more tools being applied to third parties today, only 16% of organizations say that they effectively manage third-party risks. That's a very worrying percentage, isn't it? Because we all know where there is a hole, somebody will find a way to get through it. And it seems that there's a lot of holes in our particular Swiss cheese. So during the course of our conversation today, we want to address some of that, and we want to talk about how to build a third-party risk management program that's efficient, effective, and designed to scale as your organization adds more and more cloud-based applications. And you name me one that isn't going to be doing that. So our presentation today is also designed to be interactive. We want this not just to be you listening to us rabble on about this topic, but also for you to give us some data. Give us your perspective. Let's understand how your peers think about these same topics. So we're going to run a number of polls firstly, to give you a sense for the tools that are being used in third-party cyber risk management programs currently. So our first poll, if I may ask our pollster to bring it up on screen, the question that we want you to answer is, what tools are you using in your TPCRM program today? You can select more than one, so please pick as many of these answers as you wish. Just to summarize, are you using spreadsheets, security ratings, assessment exchanges, GRC or workflow tools, vendor risk management tools, other or none? No formal program in place today. So we'll give you just a few moments to start on that, and then we're going to talk about some of these results. But maybe we should just start by acknowledging that this is a hot space that's getting hotter every day. I'm wondering, Gideon, if you might start us off, just some thoughts from your side as to why this is such an important field, why this is really coming into prominence now in a uniquely special way in some sense, right? It seems as if it's always been there in the background. There have been those who paid attention, those that haven't, but now suddenly we've got people who've never paid attention to it, paying a lot more attention to that. Gideon, why do you think that is the case?
I think there's a couple of reasons. One, IT more and more is outsourcing and leveraging the cloud. And then also, typically within a cybersecurity program, we have a good understanding of our internal controls. But when we start to use a service provider, a vendor, a supplier, whatever term we're going to use, then we don't have visibility into that control environment. And in instances where we're sharing sensitive data, or they're developing software for us, or they have access to our network, that's obviously obvious cause for concern, and we want to evaluate them ideally by some sort of assessment activity or a questionnaire supported by artifacts. So trust but verify.
Well said. And in fact, we can see, interestingly, from our poll, which is still underway, but perhaps pollster, we should be bringing that to a conclusion in just a moment. But if we're reacting to the results we're seeing so far, it would seem that everyone's trying a little bit of everything. It's got from none, and that's a surprisingly high percentage. Surprising in the sense that third-party risk is not new, but yet our ability to really get our arms around it and put programs in place clearly is challenging for many of us, and those who have perhaps moved, a long way down the path and are already using more sophisticated tools. But Gary, I wonder, as you're looking at these results, I think can you see the results at this point?
Yes. Yes.
Now, yeah. What are your?
I'm quite alarmed, actually.
What are the first thoughts that come to your mind, Gary?
Well, at first I was like, well, I was excited to see that a lot of people are actually doing something until I got to the bottom of that particular poll, and where I saw 30% were actually had no formal particular program in place. And that's not necessarily surprising, but it makes me incredibly nervous. And let me, explain to you why. On the back of the first question that you asked, which was, why, is this becoming so popular, or is it getting the scrutiny that it's actually getting right now? And that is, most organizations are coming to, the particular concern, I guess, that whether a third party is participating with your sensitive data or an application credentials, whatever it is, with your particular company or not, if they provide a vital service for you to be able to continue to service your customers, then whoever their third parties are incredibly important, and they could potentially represent a business disruption for you. And so I think that as more organizations get kind of clued into that, that probably is indicative of that 16% number. This is a huge problem. I mean, a massive problem. And so the fact that only 30% of the fact that 30% of the respondents don't have a formal program in place is quite alarming, and that we should probably be embracing at least something. Now, I'm not saying jump on spreadsheets, but at least get started somewhere.
Indeed, I absolutely agree, and we're going to get into a little bit of kind of what is it that provokes the next step. What is that next step, and how do we take it with some confidence? Before we get there, Shay, I'd love to hear your perspective as you're reacting to these results and listening to Gary and to Gideon here. What's coming to your mind?
Yeah, I think the thing that surprised me most that hasn't already been mentioned is how many people have a vendor risk management component to this. And I'm surprised by that for this reason. Typically, at least in my experience, third-party cyber risk management, or TPCRM, starts at cyber and goes out to the vendor space within the organization, rather than procurement or the traditional vendor onboarding process driving a cyber risk component down. So I'm hopeful that this is maybe the counterbalance to Gary's point, that those organizations are actually particularly forward-looking and have put in these upstream controls to ensure that dollars aren't spent until controls are satisfied. So I'm going to take the kind of glass half full approach on that poll.
We'll see if that proves itself out as we go forward here, Shay, but I like the
pretty early to be placing a mark. I understand.
There we go. I like that. Yeah, we have to take risks in risk management. So let's take a risk right now. So
and he knows me too well and my pessimistic worldview. So.
We got the balance on this panel. That's Gideon. I'm relying on you to take that middle course. All right, we're going to get into our first pillar. We said we were going to talk about 4 specific pillars. Our first pillar is strategy. And as we become more reliant on third-party tools and applications to run our businesses and run them more efficiently, a stunning statistic is that on average, an organization uses 5,800 third-party tools, which presents, obviously, potential for a massive amount of risk. I'll take this moment just to say I have had some exposure to attack surface management, and the focus often you find in that particular field of cybersecurity is really around ensuring that the vectors by which your organization can be attacked are suitably identified and therefore protected against. It's a shocking thing to think that you now have to multiply that problem by 5,800 to properly address, the attack surface that really is represented by your entire ecosystem. So let's start with a question. And maybe I'm going to start with you, Shay, which is really the question around when and why you realize the need for a more mature TPRM program. And I appreciate that all of our guests have worked with many different clients. So maybe you can just share from your experience, Shay, what is the turning point that makes you realize that a more mature TPRM program is needed? Is it a crisis? What is it that typically tips someone over into saying, you know what, we absolutely do have to do something about this?
Sure. Yeah, I think there's really 3 broad buckets that those inflection points fall into. One, we're seeing play out right now with a large ride-hailing company where you see an example of a breach that is at least directly or implied driven by a third party, that is something that executives of your organization don't want to live through, and finally decide it's time to invest in third-party cyber risk management. And I think that's quite common and a decent way to start this program, but it lacks the core pillar here, which is strategy, right? This is kind of by definition reactive. I think the second bucket is one that is kind of internally focused, but similarly driven, which is a close call or a minor incident involving a third party, and kind of that recognition that we're not doing enough. And then the third is regulatory. And we're seeing increasing prescriptive third party driven regulatory pieces from more and more governing bodies. And I think that trend will accelerate. But hopefully the value here can be kind of at least recouped, if not grown, with the strategy piece. And I say that, and I'm curious to hear what the other panelists say around these are business decisions that have been made. And so if you can align the business opportunity of using a third party and the risk that they carry, I think you're on solid ground. But I think that is far easier said than done. And that's where we need to start this conversation.
Love that, Shay. Yeah, really love that comment. And Gary, I see you nodding violently there. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I think, from a risk quantification perspective, it's very difficult to kind of quantify these things. So it also depends, I believe, with which particular industry that you're in. So if you're in a particular industrial sector where the margins are razor thin, your decision to invest in a particular place or a particular discipline of risk is going to be based on what you've seen in the past. So I think it is based on, the particular business sector that you're in, and the impact that an event could have on your particular brand reputation. For example, we have a client, I won't disclose a name, but, very apropos to the first part of the strategy that Shay mentioned, is that, you should never let a good cyber event go to waste. And that is, if you want to actually start your program, you want to go take your business case up right after something like this occurs and says, you know, exactly how much of this particular risk do you want us to try to manage now? Because this is how much we have. And so that's part of that particular strategy, but not all business sectors are going to look at this with the same level of importance as each of its peers, I guess. I'm curious what you might think, Gideon, on that.
So I think we all agree. I look at it from a different perspective slightly, as I'm always just focused on operational risk. So I happen to be in cyber, but operational risk, including privacy, fraud, insider threat. So when looking at third-party risk from an operational risk perspective, I think in terms of we may have vendors that may not be identified. So I've taken over, you know, kind of Cadillac TPRM programs that are very mature, but if we're not identifying vendors, then they're not being evaluated at all. So there's that. I'm sure we'll get to risk ranking. You know, we only have so many resources to evaluate our vendors, how we evaluate them, how we track their findings to closure. So there's that influence piece, and then there's risk acceptance or a risk register. So all of those things to me are just core value add risk management components of a TPRM program. And in the absence of them, we incur material significant risk.
Well said, Gideon. Yeah, I love that list, and we will revisit that. In fact, this is a good time for us to take another poll, asking our audience this time to talk about something you just mentioned, Gideon, which is how do you identify and prioritize your third-party risk? So if I may ask, there we are, our poll's up on the screen now. And are you tiering or prioritizing your vendors for cyber risk assessment? Let's take a quick look and see how people are doing with that. And I think, touching on one of the items that just came up, which is around quantification of risk, perhaps linked to that is risk appetite or tolerance for risk, because I think we recognize there's this balancing act between ensuring that we're investing at the right level to satisfy the appetite for risk that may exist within the organization. But one of the questions that comes up often is, well, how do you identify an appetite for risk? How do you know what big is? Is it in t-shirt sizes? Is there a dollar value somehow? What do we do about quantifying that piece, the appetite for risk piece? Gary, what are your thoughts on that?
I mean, t-shirt sizes, it's a really good way to put it. I think from a tiering perspective, you have to look at the impact that a third party's, if they were potentially removed or suffered a disruption, what would be the impact to your business? And I think that the organization that is best equipped to influence a business decision is a group of people or person that has to make that particular decision. From a tiering perspective as well, I think that if you're going to only use one single tool at your disposal for the term assessment, then you're going to tier a little bit differently than you would if you had a broad range of capabilities at your disposal. And so, I hate to, speak so philosophically, but, these things aren't exactly black and white, but I think that it's very easy, to start with what type of cybersecurity type capabilities or components is a third party going to have access to? Will they be able to connect to your network? Are they going to have access to certain applications, impact your ability to service your customers, so on and so forth? And what is the potential likelihood that this third party would suffer a disruption? And those are really easy things to start to calculate without actually having to quantify it. And you can start by making it very easy for just about anyone to do. I think put the hay down where the cows can get to it.
Yeah, there's a good I really like your questions.
Yeah, go ahead, Shay.
I like your questions, Gary, because there's something I've used very similar questions in the past, and a piece that I was hoping you would dig in on, but didn't quite get far enough, is the ownership of this vendor or third party, right? It should be clear and obvious who within your organization owns this relationship. If it's not, I think we've got some detective work to do, but that's where you start, and then you ask that person those two questions, right? If this vendor or third party went away, was not available, what would the impact be? And maybe that's just as much switching costs to another vendor as it is the operational concerns that Gideon brought up. But then the other side of that coin is, what would happen if this vendor or third party was controlled by a malicious actor? If they wanted to do bad things to us, what would that look like? And, you could play out the upside of the risk, or, the growth of that risk. We've got the operational concern and then the cyber concern, but you don't have to be a security engineer or a threat modeling expert to answer those questions. And the more approachable we can make them, the more business oriented we can make them as the managers of these programs, builders of these programs, I think the better results we have.
You're making an excellent point, Shay, which is that there's an element of dialogue required both within the business and with ultimately the third parties themselves. And I think a sort of a principle that seems to be well established today is that you have to prioritize, because you can't ask the same questions of everybody and get answers to every question from everyone in your ecosystem. You have to prioritize. And the question that's coming to my mind, therefore, is how do you prioritize? I think you've asked some very core questions there, Shay, but I'm wondering, Gideon, what are the principles by which you assess how to assess, or who needs to be assessed? What would you guide our audience who, looking at our poll here, we recognize people are at very different stages on the journey. For someone who's just starting out versus someone who's much further down the track, do the answers differ wildly, Gideon? What are your thoughts on that?
I don't think they should. So I start to think in terms of triggers. So we want to make sure we don't miss anything, right? So checking internally, and I love that Shay talked about get with your vendor managers or supply chain managers, whatever we're calling them. So I'm looking for a trigger for entry and prioritization into the TPRM program. Are we sharing sensitive data with that service provider? I think Gary said access to the network. I said earlier, software development is something that really spins me up. We think about how complex DevSecOps is. Also business criticality. So I always think of what would be a bad day for the firm. We probably really, there's a lot of focus operationally on the confidentiality aspect of cyber, but the availability aspect with critical vendors really matters. And then a little bit of quality assurance. Sure, we can send out, internal questionnaires or talk to our vendor managers and ask them about the criteria I've mentioned. I also like, once we've have everything stack ranked by risk, to take those vendor tiers, and if I don't care if it's 500 vendors, I want to go through and I want to look at it from a business category perspective. So for example, if we have a payroll vendor firm that's categorized as our lowest risk supplier, that's probably not right. So we do need to do some QA based on the tiering that we do, and most of it's going to be right with our vendor managers.
And I'm thinking about ways that people could get access to information that might be helpful to them. Maybe this is a moment, Gary, just to share a little bit about what our CyberGRX exchange offers to folks who are trying to make those judgments around, well, how much risk does this particular organization offer to my organization? How would I even start that process? Maybe, Gary, you could just share briefly on some thoughts on that.
This is kind of part of the reason why I came to CyberGRX was, after working for a long time out in the industry, after you've performed a ton of inherent risk assessments or business impact assessments, and, the ability to identify the business classification, per the example that Mr. Gideon just gave, to be able to identify exactly who that third party is, how many employees they have, the amount of income that they have, and what their attack surface is, can tell you so much about what the exposure that particular company brings into your portfolio. Gets you so far downfield so much faster. And so that's part of the capability that we provide to our customers, is we're able to do that immediately. And then, we can essentially scope their entire portfolio and say, this is what you're essentially dealing with. Now let's start to develop a plan of action on how we address that in your personal business context, right? Because this is what we know from the exchange perspective and what other exchange members are saying about doing business with these particular third parties. It's actually quite fascinating, but just to understand the business classification and understand all of that particular information about a company really can give you a jump start on a program.
And I think we're all interested in ways we can save time and be more efficient in this process. And I think that leads us to our second pillar in our 4 pillars today, and that is process itself. It's been said, failing to plan is planning to fail. I think we can all relate to that. It's certainly true with third-party cyber risk management as well. And there's a lot to think about, isn't there? From resource considerations to communication strategies to executive support and buy-in. And maybe we could just get started in this discussion around, what would you recommend, or how do you approach getting started with your TPCRM program? For those that are getting going, who are now suddenly they've been landed this responsibility, it's on their plate, they need to address it, it's become a priority in the business for one reason or another. What would be your advice? Gideon and Shay, you've been at this for many years. Gideon, what would be your words of wisdom to somebody who's starting this journey? Where should they go from here?
Thanks, Peter. So I've done this a few times. I always start with a mission vision statement with priorities and what's in scope and out of scope. And I'll go to the exec. And typically you're close. They might want to make a couple of tweaks, go away, create a process diagram off of that with swim lanes and maybe 20 different process chevrons, start, stop, all of that, critical control points. And then typically you get sign off, and I strongly recommend creating a welcome packet for internal that kind of, you can start mission vision, process diagram, and then roles and responsibilities. What are the inputs and outputs? What are the deliverables? What are your SLAs? What can people expect? Years back, I didn't do that a couple of times and kind of suffered through it. But then you want to have presentations internally and existing meeting routines so that people understand what this program is and how they fit in and what it is and isn't. Also, before I go on too long, vendor security contract addendum. A fair amount of times they don't exist or they're anemic. And we all know how important they are if there's an incident, things like that. And then jump right in, kind of start off with your highest risk vendors and do something that you can kind of sink your teeth into and show results early on.
Great advice. Shay, I'm wondering, what are the typical mistakes that you've seen? Where do people kind of get it wrong and then they have all that more work to do to go back and fix unwittingly, not realizing kind of maybe the hole they're stepping into? But I'm sure you've seen a few along the way. I wonder if there are any stories that you could share on that.
Yeah, I think one of the big ones is understanding who owns this program within your organization and how much backing or clout they're putting behind it. And that will play out in a couple of different ways, kind of to Gideon's point around getting with the internal stakeholders and ensuring alignment and what success looks like. That's certainly a part of it. That's different if cyber is driving this versus, say, procurement or the general counsel, right? And then the second piece has to do with this legal function, but I think there are other examples. Who is exempt from this flow and who can exempt themselves or accept the risk? And I see this, very regularly. Legal in particular will say, we don't have time for this process. We need new matters come up. We need this attorney in this city, or we need this firm for this type of work, and it needs to go tomorrow. I can't wait for you, TPCRM. And that's, their position, and that failing to account for that or understanding, who's going to opt themselves out of your process is going to lead to some very difficult conversations down the road. And typically those are with very high risk vendors. So just understanding those internal corporate politics before you dive too deep is very helpful.
That's great advice, Shay. And certainly I'm recognizing that there's a lot of stakeholders there's a tremendous number of different people who have opinions and even ability to impede or support the program. And here we are in whatever role we're in, trying to bring the rest of the organization with us. And in particular, it's those senior executives that have the ability to naysay or to bypass or to avoid process that we probably should be very concerned about. Yet they're the same people that are, theoretically owners of the business in one sense or another. We want them to feel that sense of ownership. It's their risk as much as it's our risk. We're simply trying to enable their business, and they often interpret it a different way. I'm wondering, Gary, as you've been engaging with people over the years, talking to them about implementing these programs, what stakeholders, typically have you found to be most impactful on the success of a program, both to the positive side, the ones that have really championed it through and made it happen, as well as those that have maybe got in the way, whether wittingly or unwittingly, and any tricks of the trade on how to overcome some of those roadblocks, Gary? How's that question?
I guess with this, I better plan on staying with CyberGRX for the rest of my employment. So it really depends, again, on the industrial sector that you're working in. The CISO is typically the champion because the security officer is typically the organization that's going to get assigned the responsibility to make the decision with whatever data it is that they get presented with about this particular third party. For some reason, it's security personnel who have to interpret this information and then make an opinion and then pass it back to the business. Unfortunately, it's the business who will veto whatever it is that that security officer establishes as an opinion. And like therein lies that particular issue. And to point back to something that Mr. Gideon said was the pomp and circumstance of actually establishing a governance structure in that project up front to say, here's what we're doing. This is a mission statement. This is the actual vision. And we're all here, and the hands in the middle thing or whatever is incredibly important, because that's when you're going to be able to identify whether this is going to be successful or not. Whoever shows up at that meeting, they're in. The people who are not at that meeting, are the people who are not going to abide by whatever procedure it is that you try to implement. And so, again, especially in a wildly fluctuating economy, all those, kind of policies about this particular third party has a residual risk level that is above our threshold, and we're not going to do business with them, right? And then, you look at the particular state of the economy and everyone's like, hey, man, it's all hands on deck right now. And so I think that I forgot what I was talking about, Peter, but I was onto something.
I think you are onto something, Gary, because what I see is that we have forces that are kind of driving the prominence of this program. Why are we all on this call today? It's because we're finding that there is a need and a demand for more appropriate solutions, either because what we're doing today just does not scale, or it's not giving us the information that we really need to have confidence that the program we're putting in place is actually mitigating and reducing the residual risk that our business is exposed to. And none of us like the idea of waking up in the middle of the night to a call saying that all our systems are inaccessible because something terrible has happened and it was as a result of a third party. So I think on the one side, we've got that positive force that says we can't ignore this. It's happening every single day to companies all around us. It's only a matter of time. Do we want to be on the front foot or don't we? And who is it in our business that should care about that? And what I've discovered is that actually this is now a board level discussion. It's now becoming something where boards are getting worried that if they don't take action themselves, they either become liable for the exposure that exists to the business. Now, you may feel there are so many layers between you and where the board is that it's almost immaterial, but the reality is that does trickle down. And somebody in the business, probably the CEO is a good starting point, actually is worrying about how to respond to these new demands, how to get in front of the board with some confidence, with some data, and not to promise that they can solve world hunger, because we're not going to do that. What we are going to do is to establish a program that we have confidence in, that demonstrates that we're taking the right steps to reduce risk to our organization, and that we're clear on what we're prioritizing and why we're prioritizing it, backed with some data. So with that, as a backdrop, I'm going to open up our next poll from our pollster. With the question that we're going to ask you to answer is, what are your biggest challenges to implementing a third-party cyber risk program? We've got a few choices here. Is it support from your executive team, the very people I was just talking about? Is it the lack of budget? Is it about the lack of capacity? I simply don't have enough people to do this, lack of tools or infrastructure, or something else? And by the way, we are super interested to hear from you directly. If you've got a comment you'd like to make, if you just want to contribute to the conversation, we won't put you on the spot, I promise, but we'd love to share your perspectives in line with the conversation. So if you have something else that you'd like to offer up, please throw it into the chat. But isn't this interesting to see where our challenges lie? And if I said it was across the board, would that be an inappropriate conclusion to draw? But it seems that leading the pack in terms of responses is this issue of capacity, and capacity and budget are quite closely related, aren't they? Because presumably with more budget, we can hire more people, we can improve capacity. But if that is where the squeeze is, let's talk a little bit about ways that we can actually mitigate this. How do we, as it were, do more with not less, because we certainly are not going to argue for less. How do we do more with what we have? How can we get beyond that tiny fraction of third parties that we're assessing today? What is it that we can do? There are new solutions available. There are new technologies. There's new approaches. What's the most effective way for us to increase our own capacity as a team? Let's tackle that topic very briefly. I'm going to go back to Gary again. Gary, in dealing with your clients over the most recent period, what are the kinds of things that they're seeing as enabling them to be able to do more with the same?
You know what, as soon as we can get past, as soon as we can suspend our disbelief and accept that, the extremely broad and ubiquitous self-assessment questionnaire is not the only tool on the planet for this one job, then a world of potential possibilities to get a very broad coverage starts to open itself up to us. And so with that, with things like outside in scanning, with things like dark web, indicators of compromise, with risk alerts, with predictive modeling and things to that effect, you can actually get quite a lot accomplished with not a whole lot of, you don't have to have a battalion of employees in order to be able to cover a very large portfolio, frankly. And so you just have to take an inventory of the tools that are available to you and start there, and then make sure that they are employed in, a very, I'm trying to, this poll is covering your face, Peter, and when I see it, I get more calm.
I have a face for radio, if I may say so, Gary, so there's no loss to anyone there.
Yeah, so just to have, to start with an inventory of the tools that you have available and to make sure that they're applied at the right time, in the right context is the best way to go about it.
Thank you, Gary. Gideon, I'm thinking about some of these other answers here because we've got people facing these challenges everywhere. Anything you'd like to add on executive team support as an example, or any of the other items here? What's on your mind as you're thinking about these results?
So I've been losing enamel off the back of my teeth with one topic. Something I've been focusing on recently is the poor quality of SOC 2 Type 2 reports. And the reason
you hit a sore nerve right there. You're just poking at that sore nerve right there.
I'll stand very firm on this very quickly. SOC 2 Type 2 reports, the framework that is used is the trusted services criteria, which they deny is even a framework, and it's very high level. You could drive a semi truck through it sideways. So next, the way that the auditors really scope and execute and have testing procedures on their assessment is they rely on a section of the report called the services description, which, get this, is written by the client. So let that digest that for a second, right? So they scope the assessment, the service provider scope the assessment. So to make this simple, let's say I'm a vendor, I'm a service provider, and I host a web application that you put sensitive data into, and I do not have a web application firewall. all I need to do is not in the service description list web application firewall, and it will not show up on the report. So this is a huge problem because, and if people are questioning me because this doesn't seem realistic, one, digest it for a while and then go back through your SOC 2 reports and see how many of them have no findings, right? So think about your own security program and how many security issues you're working on, and yet this report consistently comes back with no findings. So one way that's very manually intensive is to, I always say, have an opinion, come up with a list of common cybersecurity controls that are not listed in something like NIST CSF, like having a SOC, web application firewall. We could do this over a half hour. Have a list, and then as you go through the SOC report, look to see if it's mentioned in the system description or any of the findings. And if it's not, ask questions about it. Now, this is hugely manually intensive, but when I've done this, and I've done proof of concepts with different organizations, sure enough, you find out that if you ask and the vendors are honest, maybe you ask for some artifacts, you've uncovered a pretty wide swath of risk for yourself. So I'll offer that up.
Well, thank you. That doesn't sound like we're using less resources, but it does sound like we're getting insights which would cause us to question whether the data that we are currently using and relying upon is adequate to actually manage risk in our organizations. And I'm very aware that we have this tension, don't we, between, on the one hand, compliance, fulfilling our obligations to the business, ensuring that we have, dare I mention, a CYA strategy. Yes, we did assess this vendor, and yes, they did give us this information, and that was the basis on which we made the decisions. Unfortunately, if that information is deficient, we've actually unwittingly introduced risk into our organization and are not identifying it as such. And that leads us to the other piece, which is how much are we spending our time on compliance and meeting regulatory requirements, or even just internal requirements. We have a process, we're expected to follow it, that's what we do, versus actually managing risk. Who cares about that? And where's that becoming important in our world? I'm going to post up another poll now, and then we're going to come back to that question, because I think this is a good one for us to get into a little bit. So our third section is governance. And you could also say governance meaning who cares actually about third-party cyber risk management in your organization. So the question we're going to ask you in our fourth poll is, who owns your cyber risk or TPCRM program? So here are some options. Please fire away. Oh, I do like that. Sales, pray for me. Yeah. I think, Gary, we learned earlier that you spend a lot of time with salespeople, so you probably appreciate why that's one of the options on our poll here. But let me go back to this question of the who cares piece. Thank you, Gideon. Shay, from your experience, who should be managing the third-party cyber risk program, and who is it that cares about the risk part more than the sheer compliance checklist part? Where are you seeing that?
I think for me, the best person to own this function, and actually, frankly, a lot of other security functions, ultimately is the general counsel. And I say that because if you end up litigating, if you end up with a regulatory issue, if you end up with a breach that needs outside counsel and incident response firms brought in, if you end up with your insurance company tangling over what's covered and what's not, the general counsel is going to quarterback all of these efforts. And I think, frankly, from a risk presentation and exposure perspective, they're in a unique position to manage what the rest of the C-suite might care about. And they also own one of the highest risk business functions. If you have any kind of outside counsel utilization, you're sending those law firms your most sensitive stuff, right? Your M&A details, your IP filings, your employee litigation and human resources issues, right? You're just shipping it all out to an outside counsel firm. And so this is maybe not where it lives in most organizations, and that's okay, but I think that's where it should live if you are really looking as the goal to manage risk.
You raised a good point here, Shay, which is actually how strong is the connection between our cybersecurity team that's tasked with managing third-party cyber risk today and that legal counsel. I mean, some folks on our call may never have even had a conversation with the general counsel of their particular company, let alone have an ongoing dialogue. I'm wondering, what's a good way to start that conversation? If you've never had an engagement with someone at that level before, within the organization, you probably engage with people in their teams, let's say that. Any advice on how you can just make them aware that this is on your mind, that you're concerned about it, that you would love to be able to help them think about cyber risk as an area that's emerging. It's relatively new. I'm sure most lawyers are not taught about cyber risk when they're in law school. It's all come to pass, and we're talking about the most senior lawyers in the company now as the general counsel. They probably don't know a lot about the cyber component. They're experts in lots of types of risk associated with contracts, mostly, I suspect, but nevertheless, this is a new thing. So any guidance and advice on that? Gideon, what would be your advice to a security professional who is managing third-party cyber risk, but really wants to build that bridge to that senior legal professional?
Well, when I was a CISO, I reported into the general counsel. So a lot of the organizations I've been in, quite frankly, the legal department got it. So I would suggest that most of them are going to realize there's risk there. It's more about how to articulate from a program architecture perspective, how the TPRM, TPCRM program is going to identify and help mitigate that risk. And I think as long as you stay kind of in that mission, vision, process space, they'll be with you. If you get too far down into technology or too far down into the weeds of selecting vendors, et cetera, you'll lose them. So mission, vision slide, process slide, maybe a little bit of detail from something like the Verizon data breach report on data breaches within vendors, that type of thing. But I don't think you'll have to work too hard to convince them.
Shay, do you have a different point of view on that, or does that make sense to you?
No, I think that makes sense to me. Kind of from a more tactical perspective, I have no shame going through a lieutenant. If you have a decent working relationship with a deputy general counsel or associate general counsel, either on a cyber issue or an unrelated issue, float it with them. I would say, you could do two other things that might be helpful. One is to couch it in the workflow that they already own. Ask about, our contractual vendor contracts and cyber. How's the language there? When did we last look at it, and get things that are in their wheelhouse? And the other would be to do some potential enticement with this notion that, I think you could really lead the cyber risk management piece here, General Counsel, starting with vendors and third-party cyber risk management, but also maybe with our insurance and with our regulatory obligations and some of these other things. What's your process like for that? And start it with kind of curiosity, as opposed to the agenda of, I need funding for my TPCRM program. We do, and we'll get there, but opening with a question and being truly curious about it, I think does go a long way, especially if you don't have a rapport. Build some first, then make your ask.
That's great advice, Shay. And I do want to be cognizant of that. We've actually had a number of people putting in questions and comments in the Q&A. And I want to just thank the person that pointed out that doing more with the same does not solve the issue of obtaining funding for a TPRM solution. And I think that's a very fair point, because we're really arguing that the scope of our existing program is not probably adequate to the task. We do want to do more, and we need to demonstrate efficiency to get the justification for investment. But we want to go after incremental investment as well. And we want to do that because we want to be able to have a bigger impact in the business. And typically those two things are aligned. Any thoughts, Gideon, on making the case for investment in a TPCRM program?
I think it's relatively straightforward. If I typically will start with maybe just one slide, and I try not to slide people to death, but you have to be aware that executives think in different terms. Some of them, if you just speak to them, you've lost them. Others, if you just have slides, you've lost them. So I always try to do a little bit of both. But to have a slide, one slide that speaks to the damage that can be caused by service providers when there's data breaches, and really provide some rationale behind how, with minimal investment, considering the risk, that we can identify material risk to the organization, continue to do business, and then mitigate that risk. And in general, I've had to do this on multiple occasions, and it's not a tough sell. And the reason being is they're already concerned. Typically, you gotta remember, to me, the general counsel is a heartbeat away from the CEO. And when you start to talk about the potential for business impact, you've got their attention. So I think it's important not to speak in terms of cybersecurity, but operational risk, and give some real data and statistics that they can believe in.
One of the things that comes to my mind, Gideon, thank you for that comment, is this issue that today we're not covering the waterfront. I think it's a recognized fact that we're only able to assess a small percentage, relatively small percentage of our vendors, and by definition, that's creating blind spots. And I think if we were to be brave enough to say, but do you realize, we are literally managing a Swiss cheese here. There are holes all over the place. If we wanted to cover the waterfront, we need to make some investments. We probably need to make some investments in better tooling and infrastructure, and we might well need to make some investments in people. And as a result of us not doing that, we have an exposure today. The pushback on that typically is something along the lines of like, well, why the heck can't you be more efficient? Why can't you get more of this done? What is it that, why have you not solved this problem already? And I think some data can be super helpful in that context. And specifically, the process that is currently being used by many organizations is sending out large questionnaires, so-called risk assessments, that require a lot of hours of effort to be able to complete those on behalf of a third party, let alone on the other side being interpreted and analyzed to get the actual insights that are necessary for the business. Shay, I'm wondering, how do you think about that problem, and what way would you be responding if you got that objection that said, well, you don't need more people, you just need to be more efficient?
Yeah, well, I think there's a balance here, and particularly in this context, it's tempting to think, we should build this world-beating TPCRM program, and it should do all of these things and cover the waterfront, as you say. But if you don't have a program now, that is such a journey that that will keep you from making any progress, because it will look like it's no progress towards that ultimate goal. I think the better way is to make it less theoretical and more tangible, and just start. And if you're running a program, just improve. And so that's a little bit of a cop-out answer in the sense that it's generic, but all of us who are working in this space know what our program does well, and we know where it's weak. Our challenge now is to prioritize the 1 or 2 improvements we would like to make and talk about that cost or that level of effort. And I like to do that by playing the meaning maker. And I think this is good for the response and survey piece, but also for the program justification, which is answering that so what question. If we do these things, so what? What risk can we manage down? How much more risk could we identify? What stronger position would we be in? And similarly with those surveys that come back, it's somebody's job, probably the person on this webinar, to look at those results and say, okay, so what? Are they good? Can we still use them? Do we need compensating controls? Do we need to find another vendor? And so this lens of meaning making and answering those business questions for your stakeholders, peers, leadership, vendors, all of them, that's, I think, what really moves the needle the most. And it makes it much more tangible and keeps us out of this theoretical realm, which, for TPCRM is just a quicksand trap. You're never going to win it on theory. You're going to win it in practice.
That's good advice. Shay, we're going to move to our final pillar here around sustainability. And the question that I wanted to ask for each of our team members here is essentially, what adjustments have you made to TPCRM programs that you've been responsible for after you launched them? So basically, what is the key insight, the learning that you have now applied to future program developments that enabled you to create sustainable programs for your own organizations or for your clients' organizations? Gary, may I start with you on that?
Yeah, sure. I think that one of the things that's been really important to enable for our customers and prospects is the ability to provide them, extremely fast, we'll call them business insights, right? That very kind of punny phrase that I occasionally say, put the hay down where the cows can get to it. As people, a particular market for security practitioners, continues to surge. We have to make security information much more understandable by more people in the line of business. And so in order to make this more accessible and sustainable, we have to interpret these, these particular concepts in a way that the people in the business can read, they can, see, they can interpret, they can make a decision very, very, very quickly. And so I think that's what we're focused on, is to provide extension. Most of our particular users will not know what remote code execution is, right? They don't know what these particular concepts are. They don't know what tactics and techniques are. They don't know what a kill chain is. And so we have to take these concepts and turn them into something that a business user can interpret and make a decision on. And that's how you make this actually sustainable, is you put it in the hands of more people who can act on it.
Love it. And what comes to my mind is that, is it from a poem, that was originally water everywhere and not a drop to drink? I like to think there's data everywhere.
That's right.
To drink. And if who better than the people on this call to be able to turn that water into something drinkable for their stakeholders. So thank you for pointing us in that direction, Gary. And there are some great tools. You might like to explore cybergrx.com to find out more as to how we go about that. But of course, there are other options available in the market, as they say. Shay, tell us what your recommendation would be for our listeners today on what adjustments that you've made to TPCRM programs over the years that you would say would avoid a trap for our listeners.
Yeah, I think when I come to the sustainability piece, what I'm looking at is the delta function of time. And so moving from this point in time assessment to what your program looks like over time, ultimately maybe continuously assessing vendors is somewhere that you would like to get to. We all would, but we're not there yet. So thinking about two things. One is what you're going to do next year or next quarter, and what those mechanics are for triggering those reassessment stages. And then when vendors come in and out of your organization, how do you onboard new ones and offboard old ones to help manage that effort? And that's going to require some program development. But if you don't think about those recurring pieces and those instantiation and offboarding pieces, you're going to end up with snapshots that end up not very useful because they're in a point in time that is no longer relevant to the business. And that point in time comes up very quickly. So those would be the things I would really recommend people looking to take their program to the next level, try and focus on.
That's awesome. Thank you, Shay. Gideon, final thought from you?
Yeah, so for me, I'm always thinking about program architecture. So I just like to have a multi-year, a 3-year, multi-generational plan, and we're kind of maturing the program as we go. And then I am very mindful about how much headcount we add to our TPRM program. So I try to understand with the executive core what their thoughts are on CapEx versus OpEx. If there's ways for me to outsource a piece of the TPRM program and leverage a service, that may be really well regarded, and that money may be much easier for me to get and spend. So the more that I can, I'm always trying to throttle CapEx and OpEx to get as much resources as I can. So that's something I would recommend to folks, is be sensitive to that.
That's awesome feedback and advice. And in fact, look what's up on your screen right now. Our next monthly roundtable webinar, like this one, is going to be focused on exactly that topic. How do you make sure that you have the budget in place that you're going to need for 2023 or your next fiscal year that adequately and appropriately funds your program to do the very things that we've been talking about and enable you to invest in the people and in the tools that you will need to be successful. So couldn't have been a better lead in for that, Gideon. Thank you so much. I want to thank all of our panelists for the awesome discussion today. Thank you so much for listening and for your feedback and questions. We really enjoyed our time together with you. I certainly did. Looking forward to doing it again. Please join us. After this meeting, you're going to ask for a little bit of feedback. You can also pre-register for next month's webinar, which will be on October the 19th at 2 o'clock Mountain Time. I look forward to joining you then. Thank you, panelists. Have a great month managing third-party cyber risk.
Take care.
Take care.
Thanks.